Thank you very much, everyone. You're very welcome. Uh, you're welcome, everyone, to this Global Home Educators Exchange Council Global Homeschooling Conference. Uh, it's good to see you all who are coming in. We are glad to have all our attendees, all our participants they are in. We're going to have 7 of them. And as well, we already have attendees who are already signed up. We are so glad to have you. I think we are ready to start right away. All right, on behalf of the Global Home Education Exchange Council, I would like to welcome you all to today's session, which is entitled The Role of Parents. My name is Godfrey Kyazze. I'll be moderating our discussion today. A little bit about myself. I'm married to Olga Kyazze. We have been married for the last 12 years. We have 4 children, all of whom are homeschooled since childhood. None of our children has ever been to school. We lead a homeschool movement here in Uganda, where we live. This movement, we call it, and I also happen to be part of the East African bloc of homeschoolers and the African, what we call the African Home Educators Council. I'm part of that. And I happen as well to be on the board of the GHEX, which has hosted us today. So GHEX is grateful to our sponsors, our board members, and staff who have made this online global conference possible. Please visit our website and the conference website to learn more about GHEX at ghex.world, and to visit our sponsors links. You're welcome to visit them. They've done a wonderful job of enabling us to be here in this format. As we come together online instead of as originally planned in the Philippines, because of the pandemic, our conference theme, Home Education, a Global Movement, a global solution, shows that in spite of these challenges, the global homeschooling community is reaching out to help improve education opportunities for all children. HEX has a mission to support homeschooling everywhere for everyone as a fundamental right, regardless of why or how they choose to do it. We believe that every family, parents, and children should be respected and protected to enjoy the benefit. GHEX has been working to connect, encourage, and equip and influence organization leaders, policy who have had an interest in home education for 10 years. Learn more about GHEX at our website, www.ghex.world. I am excited about our discussion today, the role of parents, and I want to thank our speakers today. We will have 7 speakers, and they've all showed up. Each speaker will have about 15 minutes. And after all of them have presented in their 15 minutes, we shall have some remarks. We shall open it to the rest of the attendees. And if you have any questions, please, you're welcome to bring them in. You can chat with your fellow participants in the chat window, and you can send questions to the speakers using the Q&A function down there below your screen. This session is also being recorded and will be available for future access. So we're ready to begin. As already said, the title for this session is The Role of Parents. Our home education is founded upon the premise that parents have the prior right to direct the education of their children. There are tensions between families, governments, and commercial interests which can affect the role of parents. This workshop will examine the history of this ongoing struggle and discuss strategies for defending our freedoms. Today, we want to start with the first speaker, Alexandre. He will help me pronounce that better. He's the deputy head of the legal department of the Ministry of Education in Brazil. He also serves as legal counsel, the Brazilian Homeschool Association. He holds a law degree from Vanderbilt University and is also a professor of criminal and administrative law. You're welcome, Alexandre, to present to our participants today.
Okay, Godfrey, thank you. Just updating, right now I'm National Secretary of Global Protection of Human Rights in the Ministry of Women, Family and Human Rights here in Brazil. It's really a joy and an honor to be talking to you right now. And I want to invite you to give some steps back and think about the fundamentals. We are talking today about the role of the parents in education. Okay, but what is really education? Education is not usually what they call on the schools or even on the academic works about them. We must be clear about what we mean about education, then to think about the role of the parents on education. Well, it's a commonplace to confuse, to mix the concepts of education and structure. In fact, when you learn something, you've been instructed on that something, and it means only that for a short period of time, the time of the evaluation in the school, for example, you have that knowledge. And it doesn't mean that this knowledge made any difference for you. What we see in schools are not rigorously education. That's my first point. What we see in school is an industrial system of evaluation of short-term learning. We all had this experience in our teenage years to study a lot for an evaluation, and then in the next day of the evaluation, forget everything about it. It's not education. It's maybe mock education, but not real education. When we talk about the role of the parents on education, we need to understand that education is much, much bigger than that. We are talking about changes in the person. If you educate someone, if you educate yourself, how do you know that this education occurred, that this education is successful? Well, you know if in some aspect you change it for the better. Well, except from very few cases, schools can't do that. All they can do eventually is to instruct their students. Maybe in some cases, inculcate some habits. But the real transformation of the self, the real betterment of the self is not on school. It's not on school that real education happens. It's on life. It's on everyday life. Education must be a lifelong process from early childhood from to our last years. But when we talk about children and teenagers, we know that where education happens is always at home. This is not something technical, it's not something academic, but it's quite empirical. We all know for our experience that today and throughout the history of mankind, that real education was always at home. maybe in some cases, with a kind of help from very specific schools. But the real education is at home. Because it's at home that the parents can be able to not only teach their children, this is not the most important part, to teach your children, but to develop that traits of character. There is the very essence of a good education, of an educated person. In fact, when we see instruction, the transmission of knowledge, we see just a tiny part of education. And it's not even the most important part. Sincerely, I think that the instruction, the transmission of knowledge is the easiest part. It's just a piece of our great puzzle of the human beings. That means, at last, that education is really only possible for children at home. You know, we are all talking here about the rights of the parents to homeschool their children, but the brute fact about all education is that we only have education by parents to children, only. And it's not, in essence, a right, it's a duty. It's something that all parents must do. In fact, in our civil code here in Brazil, it says that the parents have a kind of, we call it family power to their children. We call power, but in fact, it's the list of the roles of the parents in regard to their children. And the first one, it's not even to educate the children. It's to coordinate the education of the children. And I would like to emphasize that our legislation is very clear that the family must educate. It's impossible to delegate education for other institutions. It's impossible and it's unlawful. I would say even unconstitutional for us. But not only that, the family must coordinate the education. And the message implicit on that is all parents, without any kind of exception, must be homeschool parents. Oh, sorry, I can't go on with that because my children are at school. Please, try to understand. Your children are at school. They are receiving instruction, knowledge, but education is with you. The coordination of education is with you. So the role of the parents on the education of the children is an integral whole. And what we are doing here is, in a sense of another, remembering all the parents of the world that they must educate their children. There is no exception and there's no option about it. Okay, but we must consider that in a lot of countries, like here in Brazil, the Constitution says that education is a duty of the family and of the state. Okay, the state, according to our Constitution and according to several other constitutions, cannot be, let's say, out of this game. But it never meant that the state must provide the service of education. We can imagine a lot of roles for the state in education that are not necessarily the imposition of a schooling model. The state can give support, the state can make evaluations, the state, even in some circumstances, can monitor the education. But in anywhere, there's an obligation of the state to provide education. I mean, there's no obligation for the families to accept the education or the instruction provided by the state. And we must tell you that this is also a political issue. What do I mean by that? When we look at the most totalitarian regimes in the world, let's say North Korea and Cuba, it's very explicit that all education must be a state education. All education must be public. There's no option for private schools. There's no option for homeschooling. And when we see the countries with most freedom in the world, we see exactly the opposite. Homeschooling in these countries are commonplace, are absolutely normal. And we really need, as we work through the laws, to reinterpret the laws from the point of view of what is really education. For example, when we tell when our Constitution tells that education is compulsory from 4 to 17 years of age, we must interpret that this means that the family must educate their children at least through 4 to 17 years. So this is the role of the parents in education. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexandria. And thank you for keeping the time. That's very, very profound, what you've shared about the importance of the parent in the education of the child. That's very critical to hear from you. Thank you very much. Next, we are going to have our next presenter, and that is Brian Brown. Brian Brown, you're with us, you're welcome. You can just introduce yourself briefly and then take it on from there. You're welcome, Brian.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. I'm Brian Brown. I'm president of the International Organization for the Family. And I'll have to speak very quickly because what I'm going to try and do is to lay out the framework for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for us understanding the deeply Christian personalist roots of the Declaration of Human Rights and how that declaration, while often used by those or attempted to be used by those who might undermine the right of parents, deeply supports and fundamentally supports the right of parents and homeschooling and education. One of the most difficult things about looking at Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is that there has been so much written about the Declaration, but Article 26, and especially the third point, gets relatively little scholarly treatment. As an example, I can show you many, many examples. I'm going to post a link to an Emory Law School research bibliography to everyone. And you will see that while the first and second points are addressed, the third is not. So what is the Article 26? What are the 3 points in Article 26? Well, everyone has the right to education. Education shall be free, at least in the elementary and fundamental stages. Elementary education shall be compulsory. Technical and professional education shall be made generally available, and higher education shall be equally accessible to all on the basis of merit. Second sentence is, education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality and to the strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. It shall promote understanding, tolerance, and friendship among all nations, racial or religious groups, and shall further the activities of the United Nations for the maintenance of peace. And third, and this is most important, this is what I want to discuss, parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children. So if we look at fundamental norms of international law, and we look at the notion that there is a human right for parents to choose education, right at the very beginning of the modern understanding of international human rights, with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, we have a very strong case with this third point. So I want to try and offer some larger framework to understand this within the context of the time. And so my talk will be on the, my focus will be on how personalism and how the idea of the human person in having rights in relation to the state both gave birth to this language and also helps us understand other aspects, especially Article 16 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I think understanding it in this way has profound implications for current policy by the United Nations and other international bodies. So if we want to understand the Declaration of Human Rights in its context, we have to go back to 1948. We have to understand who were the people that were the main drafters behind the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I'm going to point to two that I think had a profound influence on the final language of both Article 16 and Article 26. And those are René Cassin and Charles Malek. I'm going to especially focus on Charles Malek. Early drafts in 1948, especially by the Soviet drafters, did not focus on the person. They focused on the state. What they essentially said was that the state has an obligation to education for its citizens. That's not the exact language, but it's similar. Now, that startled Charles Malek and René Cassin. They said, well, if you say that the state has the obligation, and if you lead with that, you're acting as if the state is prior to the parents when it comes to human rights, and when it comes to specifically the right of education. And so there were debates, and I mean, someone could draft a beautiful screenplay or movie about the different personalities that ended up debating the language, because you had Chang from China, you had Russians, you had René Cassin from France, you had Charles Malek, who coming from Lebanon had lived through in a very pluralistic society. He was a deeply Christian man, but had profound respect for Muslims, Jews, people of other faith. And he was a very, very accomplished philosopher. Now, Charles Malek especially saw that the direction that things were going would undermine parents and families, that if the final language made the state the arbiter of education and did not reference the rights of parents, that this would be quite damaging. Now, the backstory to this, I will post as a link so you see that I'm basing this on real on some good scholarship. Ellen Carlson has written on this, and also Mike Donnelly, who is on the call. Thank you, Mike. His Human Right to Home Education is a great piece on this. But so as things played out, Charles Malik and René Cassin won. And so if you look at Article 16 and Article 26, you see there are three paragraphs, three ideas, and it moves from the most general to the most specific. Article 16, the final sentence is, the family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society and is entitled to protection by society and the state. That's the third point there. Article 16 starts with a very general idea that men and women of full age without limitation due to race, nationality, or religion have the right to marry, etc. And then it moves to the specifics. Article 26 is the same. It starts with a very general, more general ideas. Everyone has the right to education. Education shall be free. And then it moves in the third paragraph to the very specific. And it is important for us, I think, to say that the specific is rooted in a notion of the natural family, that parents have the fundamental right, that parents have the prior right to determine the kind of education their children shall be given. So we understand that Charles Malik and René Cassin had an idea that the parents should be fundamental. They did not like the early drafts that left family and parenthood out of determining the rights of children. Why? Well, I don't think it's very hard to figure out why. The fundamental reality in 1948 was, how do we not have a World War II again? How do we stop the sort of conflagration that we saw in World War II, and especially coming out of Nazi Germany? And Charles Malik was pretty open about this later in life, that, look, the Nazis thought that the state was everything. They sublimated the human person and the family under the state. And if you look at the kind of education that Malik and Cassin were worried about and how it would undermine human rights, you can look at the sentence from Hitler in 1933, before he ever has great power. He says, if the older generation cannot get accustomed to us, we shall take the children away from them and rear them as needful to the fatherland. Anyone familiar with the next 12 to 15 years in German history knows that ideas of the state rather than the parents determining the future of children, the idea of the state being primary in educating the children, the idea that the state was often and irrevocably at odds with parents, was actually the norm of pedagogical theory in Germany. And this fear motivated everyone. I think it also, in a roundabout way, is one of the reasons why the Soviet drafters, those that were a part of the discussions, ended up agreeing to this, although I will note that a number of the Soviet bloc countries did not end up signing. Out of the 8 countries that ultimately abstained, they didn't vote against, but they abstained, 6 of them were Soviet bloc countries. You also had Saudi Arabia and South Africa. But Czechoslovakia, Poland, the Soviet Union, Belarusia, Ukrainian SSR, and Yugoslavia all refused. And part of it, I think, and I don't only think, I know from the discussions, was the notion of the fact that this was too focused on individual and family rights and not focused enough on the rights of the state. So why don't we talk more about this history? Why don't we talk more about the fact that the fundamental basis of much international human rights law protects the idea of parents and families? Well, I don't really know. The only thing I can think of is that, and I'm posting the Emory University bibliography on international human rights right now. All I can think of is that there's a willful, probably attempt to sort of brush aside the third part of Article 26 on the part of educators, because some educators, those who believe that parents are a problem and don't have the prior right, and that scholars haven't followed this very interesting, intriguing story of Charles Malik and Rene Casson as deeply as they could, simply because it's not considered, it's not considered the thing that supports modern educational theory. That's all I could think, because ultimately we don't have to look at the founding documents of the United Nations or the founding documents of international modern human rights law as against us. We don't have to think that they're against parents or families or homeschooling. We can look and we can see that they firmly protect the prior right of parents and should be used repeatedly, and we should be quite aware of the fact that there was a concern at the time, there was a direct attempt at the time to say that the state is not God. The state does not decide everything, that ultimately it is the parents and not the state that determines the education of their children. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Brian. That was very profound as well, to hear the role of a parent from a human rights point of view. Thank you very much. Very quickly here, if you haven't yet, Brian, someone is requesting, Rebecca, that could you post the quote from Hitler again, please?
Okay.
You can see that quote in the
I will
chat.
do it right
so
now.
Can receive that. Thank you very much. Next, we have Robert Clarke is our next presenter. Robert Clarke serves as Senior Counsel and Deputy Director for ADF, that's Alliance for Defending Freedoms International, at its office in Vienna, Austria. He specializes in religious freedom issues and cases before the European Court of Human Rights, as well as leading efforts across Europe in defense of life, family, and religious freedoms. Prior to joining ADF International, Clarke prosecuted cases of medical misconduct for a health regulator in London. He qualified as a barrister in London, specializing in criminal and regulatory law. He can tell us more about what his credentials are, but Brian is going to share with us on how the law views the role of parents, with a focus on Europe, some real cases in Europe, and to draw a couple of practical principles to empower parents from these cases. We are very excited to have you, Brian, with us. You're welcome. I mean, Robert Clarke, you're welcome to present to us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope that you can see me and hear me clearly. I am indeed based in Vienna, but as you will have gathered probably from the accent, I am not from Vienna. I work for ADF International, and we've been involved in a number of these cases relating to parental rights and homeschooling in particular, on a number of occasions, working very closely with Mike Donnelly and with HSLDA. So we're very grateful for the invitation today. I know that there are a number of parents listening to this session, and the parents know best what a responsibility and duty and privilege it is to have and to raise children. But the big area of question nowadays is whether and to what extent the state has a role. And some people have sort of a knee-jerk reaction and say, well, of course the state has a role. And some people go the other direction and say, well, no, the state has no role. I want to take 10 minutes just to briefly touch on the position in international law. I won't repeat what others have said, but hopefully supplement a little bit. I want to then identify some of the trends that we see. So as we look at the cases that we've been involved in around the world, what are some of the common features that we see happening in a number of different places? And then I want to close with 3 very practical tips for families, for parents who are homeschooling and who may find themselves having to or want to avoid having to interact with the authorities on this sort of issue. So legally, we know that parents have the right to direct the upbringing. That's one of the phrases that we see in international law. The Universal Declaration has been mentioned. We know it talks about a prior right. The implication there is clear that it comes before anyone else's claim. The Universal Declaration, of course, isn't binding law, but that kind of language was then incorporated into texts which do have binding effect. So the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights protects, and it talks about the liberty of parents to ensure the religious and philosophical upbringing of their children. The European Convention, if I turn to my part of the world, talks about a very similar thing in one of its additional protocols. And my focus today isn't on the law, that's my background, but that's not what I've been principally asked to talk about in terms of the international provisions. But I would summarize them all by saying this. Parental rights are legally well protected and well represented in international law. Interferences violate that law and they must be justified. So there are circumstances in which there can be an interference, but they have to be justified. And I would suggest they have to pass a very high threshold indeed. Now, that's the basic position. The law is good. But we know that the picture, as you walk around, as you zoom around the world, is not that rosy. We know that there are some issues. And indeed, that's one of the reasons, it's one of the great possibilities that we have in being able to connect today and share our experiences and learn from each other. Much of the world, really, if you look at the last couple of decades, has paid very little attention to the question of parental rights. But where there has been a lot of attention paid is the question of the rights of children. And lots of people have spoken about this, lots of people have written about this, there have been lots of political and legal developments. And where people are motivated to fight child slavery and child abuse and poverty, then the intentions are good and often the results are good. But there's a risk there, because when you create rights, then you also create responsibilities. That's one thing. And the second is, as the pool of rights grows, then the potential for there to be a conflict between some of those rights, and for one of them to therefore have to lose that conflict and be deprioritized, then that potential appears. And so we have, in short, been working to challenge the increase in state responsibility for children, which has sadly come at the expense of parents. And there are a few cases that I want to use just to demonstrate this trend. I'm only going to touch on them briefly, but I'm glad to pick up on any of them really in our question time or via the chat. The first one, we'll just picture this. You and your family are asleep at home when at the crack of dawn, your door is rammed down. 30 police officers are at the scene threatening to take your children away. Well, why? Because you homeschooled them. Well, that was the potential scenario facing a German family a couple of years ago. The Wunderlich family, many of you know them, in fact, did find their house surrounded by police who threatened to use a battering ram as they sat down to their first homeschooling lesson of the year. They were taken away for 3 weeks, subjected to educational assessments, performed basically average, and they were only returned once the parents promised to send their kids to school. Germany, criminally in some states, prohibits homeschooling. We took the case to the European Court of Human Rights, and I'm sad to say it sadly and wrongly, in my view, ruled that the treatment that this family was subjected to was, and I'm going to quote, not implemented in a way which was particularly harsh or exceptional. Germany argued throughout that these measures were needed to avoid the emergence of parallel societies. There's a little silver lining in that despite that poor decision, the German courts themselves subsequently ruled that it would be disproportionate for the authorities to take any further measures against the family. And yet, of course, if you zoom to the present day, in a sort of ironic twist, the German authorities have this year been relying and needing millions of parents to homeschool their children during the first peak of the pandemic. And that's one thing that I'm not going to have time to talk about too much, but I'll just put a little pin in it if I can, because there is a tremendous opportunity for many of us who advocate on this issue and who are involved in this issue to point to really what we know and what we've known over a long period of time, given that so many others are starting now to wrestle with these questions. Now, Germany is probably the worst in Europe, but it's not the only country where parents face opposition. We also represent the Peterson family in Sweden. The UN Human Rights Committee has now agreed to take up that case, which involved a child, a 7-year-old girl, who had been homeschooled whilst on a several-month-long business trip. She'd actually performed very, very, very well. She'd outperformed her classmates during that time, and the parents thought, well, let's continue with this. They sought permission. And in Sweden, you can only homeschool if you have exceptional or extraordinary circumstances. Permission was denied. And eventually, after really losing that challenge throughout Sweden, the family were forced to move abroad, to leave the country in very, very difficult circumstances in order to be able to do simply what they believed was best for their daughter. The case continues at the Human Rights Committee. And then a final example from a different Nordic country, Norway, heralded for its apparently progressive values, and yet its child welfare system has given us countless examples of parental rights violations. The child welfare agency there is called the Barnevernet, and it's come under increasing pressure for what appears to be systematic overreach into family life, particularly when it comes to families with a minority national, ethnic, or religious background. And I want to just draw attention. I talked about patterns, and I think there's a case from Norway that actually shows a very clear pattern that we've seen repeated in whole or in part in a number of different places. So it goes like this. Someone or a state agency raises a concern about the welfare of a child. Okay, fine. The authorities are very concerned, and so they take the child from the home on an emergency basis in order to evaluate the situation, avoid the harm. Third, the parents protest against this decision, and they challenge the removal robustly. Fourth, the parents' robust challenge is seen as itself evidence that they are unfit, evidence that they are unable to be objective, evidence that they're unwilling to work with the authorities. And in some cases, what we see is that concern then eclipses or sometimes completely replaces the original concern. That now becomes the heart of the case. Fifth, contact is reduced between the parents and their child after taking away. In fact, in one case in Norway, while these proceedings were ongoing, in respect of a newborn baby, contact was set at 8 hours per year. I didn't make a mistake. That was the level of contact set. Not at the end of a procedure, but towards the start of a procedure. I'll come back to why that's completely inappropriate, perhaps beyond the obvious. The parents once again protest. You might think that this is exactly what good parents would do, but their protest is again counted against them. Time passes, and then final stage, the state argues that the child is well settled with their foster parents, and it would do more harm than good to disrupt the status quo, so the child should remain. We have seen this pattern countless times. The approach does not comply with relevant human rights law. The intervention in the first place should be rare, and it should be justified. And even in the truly rare cases when it may be necessary to take that kind of emergency step, the state, and this is important, has an obligation to pursue the return of a child and provide support to make that possible. And that's actually what the Grand Chamber, the highest level of the European Court of Human Rights, ruled in a recent case against Norway. And this wasn't specifically a homeschooling case, but it's one that should affect anyone concerned with parental rights, because the court said the state's job is not just to come in and to find a better parent for a child. The state's job is not to come in and second guess the decisions that a parent has made. The state's job, if there is a risk and there's a high threshold, is to support, is to provide support to the parents, not to consider them an adversary. And so I know some of this may seem bleak to parents that want to or who are homeschooling, but I want to come back to my earlier message, which is the law is on your side, but there are still some states where these cases are raging, but we are seeing progress at the international level. That Grand Chamber case in Norway is just one of them. And so just having these things in mind, that the law is on side, but there are nonetheless some challenges, I want to close with 3 practical steps that I'd encourage any parent to take when thinking about or engaging in homeschooling. First, know your rights. If you're not connected with, depending on the country, a HSLDA or similar organization present within your jurisdiction, then get connected, because the position does vary from country to country. HSLDA and other organizations do fantastic work. And it's important you know what the requirements are. Knowing this, in a sense, acts as a safeguard to try and prevent that cycle, which can so quickly spiral, even starting. So I don't say out of fear, but out of a desire to live as people who are knowledgeable about our obligations, knowledgeable about the law of the country in which we live. Secondly, in case of trouble, get experienced legal representation. That might sound obvious, but the number of cases that come to us where parents have started to engage with the authorities, things have taken a turn for the worse, the parents tried to engage more, and then ended up in a situation where finally they cry out, help, I need a lawyer. And yet at that point, the record is built, there have been things said and done that aren't helpful. And so, again, I don't want to frighten, but if you find yourself in dialogue with the authorities and getting experienced legal representation. I say experience because the reality is this is a complex area of law. Legal representation is essential, and actually the implications in this area are perhaps more serious than even in the criminal law. And finally, do cooperate, but don't be naive. So if you are unwilling to cooperate with the authorities, that will almost certainly be counterproductive. But an experienced lawyer should be able to guide you in terms of the level and type of engagement. And so with that, I know my time is at a close. And so I just wanted to close with those 3 very practical things. But if you'd like more information on that, or pointing to some of the resources are out there, or indeed more information on the cases and some of the things that are pending at a legal level, then I'll be glad to deal with those in whatever time we have remaining for questions. But thank you very much for listening, and back to Godfrey. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. That was very good, very good. Thank you for those action points you've ended with. I think those are helpful for many parents, especially those who are just beginning this journey to know. And the point you've made that the state's role is to support the parents. That's a very important aspect for us to ride on and to see how do we strengthen this in many of the countries where it doesn't seem to be the case. Thank you very much, Robert. Our next presenter, next panelist is Sharon. We have Sharon Slater, who happens to be the president of Family Watch International. Sharon is going to talk to us about the assault on the role and rights of parents from UN policies and UN programs, especially with regard to sex education and the protections for parental rights in international law. Also, what the research shows with regard to abstinence versus comprehensive sexuality education, and with regard to parental involvement in sex education. We are very excited to have you, Sharon, share with our audience. You're welcome, Sharon.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here and to talk on this important subject. My presentation will be the UN's assault on the role of parents, reclaiming parental rights. And I'll warn you that I'm going to give you some quite troubling information, but be patient. Towards the end, I'll give you good news, and I'll give you a few things that you can do about the things I'm going to present. Family Watch International, the organization I represent, works to protect the family as the fundamental unit of society. But if we are going to protect this important unit, we must protect the health and innocence of our children, because they will form the future families of the world. So we spend a lot of our efforts protecting children from ulterior attacks. And there is an all-out assault by multiple UN agencies on children and the family, as I will show you. And part of this attack is an attempt to separate children from their parents and from their values. And this attack often comes through human rights, distorting human rights. They call it a human rights strategy. And it's helpful to understand children's rights in two different categories: protection rights and autonomous or independent rights. Children's protection rights include all sorts of things which we would all agree with. The children need clean water, food, health, shelter, medicine, health care. But then when you get into the controversial autonomous rights for children, these are more adult-like rights that the UN agencies are trying to grant to children. Things like the right to privacy, confidentiality, information, association, and sexual expression. And as we've already heard, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights sets out the standard. Parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children, yet this is under an all-out assault. Now, talking about rights, we need to look at the Convention on the Rights of the Child, a binding treaty which almost every nation in the world has signed. It states, convinced that the family as a fundamental group unit of society and the natural environment for the growth and well-being of all its members, and particularly children, should be afforded the necessary protection and assistance. So the family's role with children is to be protected. Then you get to Article 3, and it states, the governments should undertake to ensure the child such protection and care as is necessary for his or her well-being, just taking into account the rights and duties of his or her parents or legal guardians. Then when you get to Article 5, it gets more controversial. It states, state parties shall respect the responsibilities, rights, and duties of parents. And then it limits these rights by saying to provide in a manner consistent with the evolving capacities of the child. What does that mean? Appropriate, and who decides what's appropriate, direction and guidance. And this is all only for the purpose of the exercise by the child of the rights recognized in the present convention. United Nations Human Rights, or the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, has created a series of information series on sexual and reproductive health and rights. And this one on abortion states, it actually reiterates a comment by the Committee on the Rights of the Child, the committee that is monitoring compliance with the UN Convention on the Child. And it says that this committee has especially emphasized the right of the child in accordance with evolving capacities, there it is again, to confidential counseling and to access to information without parental or guardian consent. It says states should review and consider allowing children to consent to certain medical treatments and interventions. What type of medical treatments and interventions? It says without the permission of a parent. Well, here it tells us what kind: interventions related to sexual and reproductive health services, including education and guidance on sexual health. This is a very controversial term, which encompasses contraception and abortion. Let's look at sexual health. Sexual Health, Human Rights, and the Law is a publication that is published by the World Health Organization and the HRP, which contains all of these various UN agencies, the Human Reproduction Program. They have the definition for sexual health that is controlling at the United Nations, which includes sexuality, which also includes access to contraception and abortion, pleasurable and safe sexual experiences, and the recognition of the diversity of sexual behavior and expression. It goes on to state that in order to respect and protect human rights, states must ensure that health services are available to meet the specific sexual and reproductive health needs of adolescents. The UN defines adolescence as beginning at age 10, and these services need to include contraception and safe abortion services to fulfill the needs of adolescents. It also claims that human rights standards at the international, regional, and national levels must require states to guarantee adolescents' right to privacy and confidentiality. These are the autonomous rights we talked about, by providing sexual and reproductive health services, again, without parental consent. It also says that governments are to provide information and education, including comprehensive sexuality education, and says that this is crucial for sexual health. Now let's talk about comprehensive sexuality education. This is the premier publication of the United Nations called the International Technical Guidance on Sexuality Education, which purports to show all governments what they must provide as sexuality education. And unfortunately, it has the firepower and backing of all of these various UN agencies, including the World Health Organization, which is supposed to set the health standards for the world. And yet, this publication attempts to redefine abstinence, teaching children that abstinence means not just choosing not to have sex, but also deciding when to start having sex and with whom. Children are to be taught to recognize that each person's decision to be sexually active should be respected. They're to summarize key elements of sexual pleasure and to differentiate between the values that they hold and that their parents or guardians hold about sexuality. Here we see they're trying to separate the children from the parents' values, especially in sexual matters. So this is a very controlling document that sets the standards for the whole world on sexuality education. Now, where did this come from? Who's writing these manuals? Well, this organization called RFSU claims or boasts that they participated in the development of the International Technical Guidance on Comprehensive Sexuality Education. Who are they? Well, this is one of their booklets on what teens should be taught about sex called Sex Your Own Way. And as you can see, it has highly controversial teachings for teens. So who is RFSU and where did they come from? They are funded by the Swedish government, and they actually were one of the founding organizations of International Planned Parenthood Federation. And they are a member association of Planned Parenthood Federation, and they hold special consultative status with UNESCO. International Planned Parenthood Federation is the largest provider of sexuality education and promoter of abortion throughout the world. And they have 65,000 service points in 170 countries, and they benefit financially when children are sexually active. When children are sexually active, they're going to possibly buy from Planned Parenthood condoms. They're going to need abortions. Planned Parenthood is providing hormones to help children attempt to change their sex, contraceptives. They provide sexuality education programs and sexual counseling. Now let's go back to this document. Who's writing this document? Well, one thing that's not disclosed on the cover is that they have another partner in the Human Reproduction Program, the HRP, and that's International Planned Parenthood Federation, who we believe they are writing most of the manuals and policies for these UN agencies. Now let's get back to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Here's one of the autonomous rights that it attempts to grant to children. The child shall have the right to freedom of expression, and this right shall include freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers. What about parental rights to guide those things? Well, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child has issued a comment saying that these provisions within the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child now mean, in their comment number 15, that children should have sexual and reproductive freedom. Really? Confidential counseling without parental or legal guardian consent, and sexual education without the permission of a parent. Yet these things are not in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Let's talk about UNICEF and how they are violating parental rights. In this publication by UNICEF, it states, for adolescents, the possibility to have access to sexual and reproductive health services without parental consent is a critical dimension of access. Back to the convention. It purports that state parties need to recognize the rights of the child to freedom of association. So this could mean that parents could not limit who the children would communicate with or associate with. Back in 2010, we found this problematic report from the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education, where he actually said that parents who exempt their children from sex education are a barrier. Children have the right to pleasurable sexual experiences, which can only be achieved through comprehensive sexual education from the outset of schooling. Then the convention also wants to grant children the right to privacy. It states, no child shall be subjected to arbitrary or unlawful interference with his or her privacy, family, home, or correspondence. And while this sounds really nice, what if it's interpreted to mean that the parents cannot interfere? And when this was written, I can guarantee you they weren't thinking about digital privacy and the internet and use of the internet, yet this is how it's being applied by the UN. In fact, this publication by UNICEF called Children's Online Privacy and Freedom of Expression actually states that children can freely and confidently use technology without disproportionate monitoring by government or parents. Unnecessarily strict moderation or policing of user-generated content, or unwarranted limitations of anonymity. It states children can explore the digital world without encountering overly restrictive filters. Then in this publication, Privacy, Protection of Personal Information and Reputation, UNICEF states that requiring parental involvement and consent for the use of widely available online services, for instance, can impede children's freedom of expression. There we have it again, an autonomous right, their access to information and development of digital literacy. Parental controls can similarly threaten children's free and confident use of technology. More recently, we have a new UN expert called the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Privacy, who aims to protect and empower children with respect to the online environment. He sent out a call for comments or submissions, and in this call, he stated that the submissions should relate to the privacy rights of children under the age of 18 and issues related to their independence and autonomy, and suggested that people give comments on the following: the development of personal identity or self, including gender identity and expression, the sexual development of the child and the importance of private spaces for the child, both online and offline, in which one's sexuality can be further explored. This is an all-out assault on our children and on the rights of parents. But I told you there is good news. As far as comprehensive sexuality education is concerned, also known as CSE, the United States has been leading the charge at the UN and UN negotiations to oppose CSE, along with the African voting bloc that has a strong position, and they've been blocking multiple provisions that have been proposed in UN documents under negotiation about CSE. So what can you do about these violations of our parental rights and this assault on our health and children? Well, number one, we invite you to get informed. We invite you to go to familywatch.org and sign up for our newsletter, where you can get the information about what's going on when these UN negotiations happen. You can also find on our website our family defense handbook called Stand for the Family, a call to responsible citizens everywhere. And this will have talking points and information and tools to help you defend your family and your parental rights and the health and innocence of your children. We also have an online learning course, the International Family Law and Global Health Policies course. And we have a series of webinars that we're folding into this course that we're holding, and all of this is free and online for you. We would encourage you to participate in our webinars. In fact, many of the slides that I showed you are part of our UN series of webinars. In fact, we also have 2 upcoming webinars we invite you to. One's even tomorrow at noon Eastern time. This is when we're co-sponsoring with the Protect Child Health Coalition. You can find this at protectchildhealth.org/webinars and register. This is a very important one on protecting children from the transgender agenda. And then as part of our university and our series of webinars on the United Nations, our next webinar is on December 1st. It's called Wrong-Headed UNAIDS Sexual Policies, a Matter of Life and Death. And you can register for that one at familywatch.org/webinars, or just click on the webinars tab on our website at familywatch.org. So number 2, after you've got informed, watch the video and sign the petition at stopcsc.org. We have a documentary called The War on Children, which exposes the comprehensive sexuality education worldwide and at the United Nations. And we invite you to go to this website and sign the petition calling upon the UN and member states to stop sexualizing children through comprehensive sexuality education. You'll notice we have it subtitled in 12 different languages, and it's been a powerful tool to stop CSE in many UN negotiated documents and also in national and local policies. And then finally, we invite you to spread the word and work with us to protect our families by protecting the health and innocence of our children. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've got some glitch here. I'm wondering whether I'm on. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, sorry about that. Thank you very much for your sharing, Sharon, with us. Next is Pavel. Pavel is sharing with us from Russia. Pavel, you're welcome to share with your audience.
Thank you, Godfrey, and thank you, dear friends, for all the wonderful presentations we've had today, and I'm sure we will have. So before I'm going to cover my topic, I would like to make 2 points that I think are important for us. First, I'd like to remind to all of us that we don't really need international or national law to understand that home education and parents' rights are human rights, as it definitely belongs to the realm of natural law and natural rights. So obviously, so that the upbringing of children by parents was mentioned even by the earliest Roman lawyers, who were among the first speaking about natural law as a term in the history. And we should revive, of course, we should revive the respect to the natural law and natural rights. And I believe this is a very important part of our common mission. And the second point, I would cover in more detail what was touched by Brian in his excellent presentation, that is about the context of the Article 26.3 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and intentions behind its language, which is important for both interpretation and application of all the relevant international human rights norms. Most of the contemporary international human rights language related to the rights of parents in education of their children originate in the language of this article that states that parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children. Though not legally binding in itself, the language of the Universal Declaration forms an important hermeneutical background for the interpretation and application of the other universally and regionally recognized human rights norms. Nearly all of the most important relevant international human rights treaties contain direct references to the Universal Declaration in their preambles. This includes the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the Convention of the Rights of the Child, and such regional instruments as the European Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, and the Commonwealth of Independent States Convention on Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. Therefore, it's important to have a look at the language of Article 26.3 of the Universal Declaration in its historical and logical context. Universal Declaration was one of the first international human rights documents created by the United Nations, and the very idea of the United Nations as an international organization, as well as its declared aims, are deeply rooted in the terrible experience of the Second World War and crimes of the Nazi regime associated with it, as Brian has reminded us. This context is obvious in the preamble to the UN Charter. The first aim of the United Nations stated therein is to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind. It's clear that then that the second aim stated in the preamble to reaffirm faith in the fundamental human rights and the dignity and worth of the human person and the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small was closely connected to the first one. Therefore, Article 55 of the Charter urging the United Nations to promote universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion also should be understood in its relation to both of these aims. At the same time, there existed a general consensus among the nations that the UN Charter itself didn't sufficiently define the rights it was referring to. It is in this context that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was created as a foundational text for achieving these aims of the United Nations, including its Article 26. So as we can see historically, the language protecting the fundamental right of parents to choose the kind of education for their children reflects the tragic experience of the massive violations of inalienable human rights under Nazi rule. This experience is directly referred to in general words in the preamble of the declaration itself, stating that disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. Johannes Morsin, a scholar, notes in his book, The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Origins, Drafting, and Intent, was published in 1953, that in fact Article 26.3 is one of the articles of the declaration that were most clearly shaped by the experience of war, quotation. Under Nazi rule, the right highlighted in this article was heavily violated. Parents who tried to keep their children out of the Hitlerjugend and other instruments of Nazi ideological indoctrination, Nazi Germany's state educational system included, were accused of abusing parental authority and persecuted. And this experience of abuse of state power for the ideological indoctrination and brainwashing in education was in fact the real historical reason for introducing the language in question into the declaration. This is clear and well-documented historical fact, and I'll just briefly refer to some intentions clearly stated that were behind the language. During the negotiations of the text of the Universal Declaration, Catherine Schaffer, the representative of the International Union of Catholic Women's Leagues, quote, observed that the two articles on education and culture fail to mention the fundamental right and responsibility incumbent upon parents to educate their children as they saw fit. If that right were not stated in the declaration, there might well be a recurrence of situations such as that which prevailed in Germany under Hitler. This end of the quote. This position was supported by a number of delegates. Then the Dutch delegate, LGC Beaufort, pointed out that, quote, parents would be unable to bear the primary responsibility unless they were able to choose the kind of education their children should have. Nazi Germany, where Hitler used deprived parents of control of their children and provided an experience which should never be permitted to recur, end of the quote. Carton de Viar, the Belgian delegate, noted that, quote, in effect, the family had prior rights over the state, which it would be useful to recognize in one way or another in a statement of principle such as Article 23. That was a number of course in the draft. Then, as Morsink describes, the Netherlands representative had expressed the horror which the Nazi-occupied countries still felt at the thought that the state could compel children to be deformed morally and intellectually by the doctrine of the party in power. It would in fact be an error not to retain the rights of the family in an article of such importance, especially as it could not be assumed that the rights and duties of the state in the field of education have been disregarded by so doing. As a result of the discussion, the amendment introduced by Lebanon became what we know now as Article 26.3 of the Declaration. Most of those voting in favor of the amendment, said Morseng, had been impressed by the argument that recent Nazi abuses of the power of the state had to be thwarted. Shaista Ikramullah of Pakistan thought it was essential to guarantee freedom to choose education, a principle flagrantly violated by the Nazis. It should be noted that in fact the strongest opposition to the proposed language came from the other totalitarian regime of the time, the communist Soviet delegates. From this context, it's clear that Article 26.3 should be interpreted as providing the protection of genuine freedom of conviction and human dignity, stressing the natural and fundamental right of parents to choose the kind of education for their children against the possible abuses of state power. This is an important point that can help understand the background of this language also in terms of legal ontology. The language of Article 26.3 should obviously be understood in its connection with another fundamental norm of the Declaration, that of Article 16, stating that the family is a natural and fundamental group unit of society and is entitled to protection by society and the state. Another important connection is that of religious freedom, as Article 18 of the Declaration stresses that everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom either alone or in community with others, and in public or private, to manifest his religion in teaching. These communities with others must obviously also include the family, the natural and fundamental group unit of society. The freedom of thought, freedom of religion, of opinion and expression thereof, which also is enshrined in Article 19, from the universally recognized base for any genuinely democratic and free society as understood by the fundamental international human rights instruments. It's quite obvious that this freedom becomes merely declarative and impossible in an environment where the uniformity of education, especially in terms of values and ideology, is imposed in a compulsory way. But this is inevitable when the state monopolizes the education in terms of ideology and values. In fact, that means that it is also inevitable when the state has a monopoly to define the general content of education, as it's clear from the modern point of view that the absolutely neutral factual content simply doesn't exist, as any presentation, even of the mere facts and factual analysis, is deeply influenced by one's values and philosophical background. There's hardly such thing as a neutral education. The child is, by its very nature, marked by, quote, physical and mental immaturity, as also the Convention on the Right of the Child says us. The fact is that the child depends on adults in its development. The primary value and worldview background for the child is determined by the kind of education he or she receives. This environment, in fact, could be chosen only by his parents or guardians, or by the public authority of different kinds, or different kinds of their agents. Taken away from the parents and family, the power to determine the environment would in the end inevitably rest in the hands of the public authorities or their substitutes. There are no other practical options besides either the family or public authorities. The Universal Declaration and the subsequent international human rights instruments have definitely chosen in favor of parents and family. This is quite reasonable, as it's the family, not the public authority or other communities, that is the fundamental and natural group unit of the society. The society consists from families and in a way exists for families, and the well-being of the family forms an inalienable part of the common good. This context makes it quite clear that the protection of the natural and fundamental right of parents to direct the education of their children according to their own freely determined religious, philosophical, moral, and pedagogical convictions and values is the most necessary condition for the existence of the free and democratic society as such. This forms a real basis of the subsequent developments secure in the universally recognized international human rights instruments. It is in this context that they should be interpreted, understood, and applied. And it is really a catastrophe that some states are forgetting of the historical reasons that lead to formulating these norms, while trying to return to the totalitarian unification models in education, reviving thus the Nazi etatist approach to education, statist approach to education, and using the state coercion to demolish the parents' rights in education, which are in fact among the most important and most basic natural human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pavel from Russia, for that very good presentation that you've just made to us. We really appreciate. I will encourage you, especially our attendees, to continue checking on the chat. There's discussion that is continuing on there. You can be part of that, and some of the questions are responded to there. And where you have a question still down on your screen, there's the Q&A button. You can put a question there, and one of our panelists could respond to it, just in case we are not able to even have time to respond to all the questions at the end. Otherwise, our next presenter is Terry Harding. Terry is one of the pioneers of both homeschooling and non-governmental distance education in Australia. He has been influential in the development of both of these forms of education from the viewpoints of a practitioner. Terry and his wife, Diane, home educated their 5 children for 15 years. He's a communicator. He has been a keynote speaker at home education conferences across Australia and overseas, and has lectured on home education at university and various colleges. A homeschool administrator, Terry led a team which grew a homeschool support organization to assist over 4,000 homeschooling students and their families. He's a researcher. He has a master's in education and a PhD, which researched home education with a focus on why people choose this model of education and what are the roles of parents who educate their children at home. Distance education, he has played a key role in assisting with the commencement and development of non-government distance education in Queensland, New South Wales, and Western Australia, and an informer of policy. He has and continues to inform both state and federal governments concerning homeschooling and non-government distance education as they develop policy for both of these modes of education. He's an educator in addition to leading Australian Christian homeschooling for over 25 years. Terry has worked as a school principal and head of distance education in 4 Australian states. Terry enjoys family life, including 9 grandchildren, theology, history, politics, reading, and research. We are glad to have Terry share with our audience today. You're welcome, Terry. You are on, Terry. Can you unmute? We can't hear you.
How are we right now, Godfrey?
You are on.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Godfrey. It's great to be a part of this very special seminar. Thank you so much to the presenters thus far. I appreciated earlier statements regarding education, and I would like to just add another thought. My presentation will be more philosophical and a few definitions. I'd like to suggest some parental roles philosophically, and then also just share my research findings, which were directly looking at the roles of parents who home educate in Australia. But firstly, just adding to the idea of education, I would suggest education is life, the communication of life from the living to the living. And in one sense, it is really about reproduction in so many different levels. Okay, well, the family is the original nucleus of society. Parents in families are shaping our future society from the ground up as they raise their children. So let's see, we're going to, let's make this move. Oh, there we go. Parents have a temporal and a historical role to fill, and that is that they link past ancestors via themselves in the present to the next generation. They are the bridge between the past and the future. The past being those ancestors who've died, the present meaning they themselves, and the future, that is their own children. And that carries on generationally to grandchildren, etc. Edmund Burke, the great Irish statesman and philosopher, spoke about this, seeing society as an association between the dead, the living, and the unborn. He understood that there's a line of obligation and cultural transmission that connects we parents to those who gave us what we have, that is our parents, and it's passed on through us to our children, whom we give what we have. As their children become parents, they extend that line of cultural transmission to future generations, thus generating future societies. This line of obligation is driven by the phenomenon of familiar love. So here we just see just a graphic illustration of the transmission through generations. And this has happened for millennia. Now, that's historically speaking, and now spiritually speaking, parents are also a direct life-bearing connection between Almighty God, who is the giver of life, to their own children, who are the receivers of life. From this point of view, parenting is a divinely appointed role. Given that the parent-child relationship was in existence for thousands of years before the development of human government as we know it, the parent-child relationship takes precedence over any other socially constructed relationship or authority, including human government. Whilst other social relationships do affect the shaping and development of a child, the child's ultimate shaping and development is embedded in their own parent-to-child relationship. The child and the parents share genetic information, biological features, historical experiences, psychological formation, familial relations, common values, common beliefs, spiritual practices, and extended periods of time with each other. All of these experiences cultivate the education of a child. So here I just wanted to illustrate my point earlier that we have Almighty God, the giver of life. We have the parent, the conduit of life, and the child, the receiver of life. Very definitely an important role, a spiritual one. Okay, so parents are educators. They link life-giving. And I want to take this opportunity just to quote Pope John Paul II, who, to my view, put a brilliant definition of the right and duty of parents to educate their children. And thus I'll read, "The right and duty of parents to give education is essential, since it is connected with the transmission of human life. It is original and primary with regard to the educational role of others on account of the uniqueness of the loving relationship between parents and children. And it is irreplaceable and inalienable, and therefore incapable of being entirely delegated to others or usurped by others." And we've heard very much about that with previous speakers. The declaration we've covered nicely. So there we have it there, the key and poignant point that parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children. Now, this is just a declaration. That's all it is. It declares a right or a responsibility. It does not give the right or responsibility. And that's important for us all to understand. And I think our previous speakers have beautifully explained that. So it's a declaration of something that existed before this declaration, well before. And we've already heard the example of Germany, and I've just made the point here that many signatory nations that have actually signed this document actually deny the prior right, which is written into the document. I want to just look now at the context of homeschooling and just have a few simple illustrations to tickle your eyes, I guess. So here we have the context of the home. We have a mother, and you'll see on her head number of roles. And I'm going to talk about a couple of those roles with respect to my research. So there she is, she's in home. And here we have a couple of children, wonderful. And there's a context of the real world. And so education is not just schooling, as speakers previously have alluded to. It's a reality of experiencing life transmitted from the living to the living in the real world. And so I just want to elaborate on that, please. So in my research, I asked the question to home educators, what are your roles? And took a phenomenographic approach. And ultimately, it's a fancy way of saying looking at differences. And I ended up with around 86 different pools of meaning from the research, and then reduced that research to common categories that were helpful to understand what are the roles of parents who home educate. So the first role was I am a learner. That's the parent, not the child. The second role delivered was I'm a partner. Now that doesn't refer to specifically just a contractual arrangement. It means I'm a partner with a spouse or other people who are involved in this educational adventure, educational experience. Thirdly, more obvious, I'm a teacher. And finally, I'm a pioneer. And I'd just like to, before I finish, just elaborate on those roles and clarify a couple of points that may give encouragement and assistance as parents who are home educating, trying to understand what they're actually doing. So let's have a look. Just have a look at those four roles, and then I will conclude with a brief description of the Australian experience, and that will be it. The roles, firstly, I am a learner. The parents were saying that I have to really seriously take the concept of education and learn about that, teach myself about that. I have to take this more seriously because there's another layer of education. It's called home education. It's a thing I don't really know much about. I think I better learn about that as well. I'll need help to learn about it. I better start to look at curriculum and start to see what I think is necessary for my child's education. I think I better start learning about my child's specific needs. My child's advanced, gifted, my child has learning disabilities, etc., etc. And this last one really touched my heart. Parents were saying, I have to study my child. Very precious statement. It does allude to the previous one, looking at my child's specific needs, but it just meant these respondents were saying, I'm looking at my child in a deeper way. I'm stepping back. And there's a good scripture verse which talks about even a child's ways are known by his doings, which implies that really we should, as parents, step back and study that child. The second role of home educating parents, they were saying, I'm a partner in a new educational enterprise. These partners, generally married partners or husband or wives, usually, there was a division of responsibilities. There was a shared labour focus. If you like to use schoolistic language, forgive me if I do, but you know, they would take the role of a principal, they would take the role of a teacher, they would take all the various roles that you see in schools. These parents were sharing those responsibilities, but of course, homeschooling, home education is not schoolistic. It's about life, the totality of life and the communication of life from the living to the living. So it's far more. But in terms of specific pedagogies, etc. They were just sharing these different roles. It meant one thing that came out in the research was that people that were staying in the home education environment saw their spousal relationships deepen as they took their responsibilities more seriously and more focused. That was a wonderful thing. One of my wife and I love doing marriage counselling, and we love looking at the theology of sexuality. And so to hear these families or these parents saying, deepened our relationship, it was a wonderful thing to hear. And of course, it deepened our relationship with our child just by the very nature of the amount of time and the voluntary nature. I am going to spend 15 years, 20 years, just raising you, discipling you, nurturing you as my child. It developed great relationships. So that was interesting to hear. The final two major roles. One was I'm a teacher, and it talked again, it had alluded to the previous statement. I have a deeper relationship. My child is my friend. Now, I'm not trying to paint the picture with rose-tinted glasses. Of course, parents and children are normal human beings who have their clashes, etc., but it still meant they had a deeper and closer relationship, just looking at the quality of time. And I used that, and I have a time index, which I quantify the amount of time different types of families spend with their child, whether they're spending their child, sending their child to school, whether they're a dual parent relationship, single parent relationship, all these different aspects of family. The home educators, whether they were single parent families or dual parent families, on single incomes, all these things, they were saying we have a deeper relationship. I'm now instructing, that's an obvious one for the role of teacher. I'm doing organising, more organising than I've ever had to do before. I'm observing my child in different ways. I'm assessing my child, and so on. The final one, I'm a pioneer. It was really eye-opening to hear these families, what they saw themselves as. I'm a pioneer. I'm reshaping the concept of education. They're reconceptualizing what the Western world or the Australian context said that education is, or schooling is, reconceptualizing it totally in terms of lifestyle. And flipping that coin on the other side, we are reconceptualizing the idea of family. They're now saying family is a site of education. That's a radical position when you look at the history of education and pedagogy in the West, where it has narrowed itself down to the concept of education happens at school. So they saw themselves, I am an advocate for education. I help new educators and I support them. So that was another factor in the pioneering concept. We're doing something new. And the final one that came out was we're really contributing to our community because we are shaping good citizens. So here are the roles, and you see on the top level, this is coming out of Merton's role theory, 1954. The role of a parent, I haven't listed them all, but on the top line, we just take that role of parent, go down to the second level, and there's parent role number 1, number 2, and there we have my role as a home educator, and go down to number 3, and there we have that structure of I'm a learner, I'm a partner in educational experience, I'm a teacher, I'm a pioneer. So just a helpful framework to see. And so I'll just conclude by just sharing a little on the Australian context. Home education, homeschooling, they use the same, both words in various states and territories. Australia is about the same size as the US. Yeah, there are 6 states, 2 territories. Homeschooling is legally recognised in all states and territories. Parents are responsible for the child's learning, not the state, not a school. The parents are seen as responsible. But But in order to home educate under various education acts in states and territories, they have to be registered. And essentially in each of the states and territories, basically the parents have to submit a learning plan, and that gets approved. However, there's been, and I've been in this for a long time, there's been a lot of change in the registration criteria, and depending on the bureaucrats who operate the registration processes, they seem to grow that power and change the criteria. I call it educational bureaucratic power creep. And there are many Australians who home educate who choose not to register. That is operating outside the Education Acts, and thus they have to submit to, they could take the risk of sanctions and fines. There is another form of home-based education in Australia called distance education. It's been operative in Australia for about 100 years because Australia is such a vast continent, big distances between regions and locations. Schools provided education at distance. And so it's different from homeschooling, because in distance education, the school is responsible for the child's learning, but ironically, the parent is the main home tutor on site, the elephant in the room, but it is schoolistic. And thus it's bound to the school's curriculum and timelines. And it's also funded by the state and Commonwealth funding mechanisms. So private education and distance education is funded in Australia, and that can come with strings, but it also allows for some independence. So look, that's probably the end of what I wanted to say, apart from to say that in Australia, we are seeing exactly what has been stated, what Sharon was talking about. We are seeing that in government schools. We're seeing the concept of gender fluidity, all those other sexual attacks and attacks on the family. We are seeing that, and that is one of the factors that's growing home education in Australia. So I hope the concept of the roles, the historical connect, the spiritual connect, and the four roles that came out of my research give you a few ideas. So thank you. Back to you, Godfrey.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Terry. That was very insightful. I think many of the parents are resonating with those four roles, being pioneers. Many of us find ourselves in that pioneer role in many of the places where we come from, teachers, partners, and learners. We learn with our children. That's very insightful. Thank you very much. And lastly, but not least, in our presentation, we have Charles Glenn. Charles Glenn is from Boston. He has an extensive resume, but I want to welcome Charles to come and present from your wealth of experience to share with our audience here about the role of parents. You're welcome, Charles.
Thank you very much. And as a parent of 7 children, I've had a lot of opportunity to think about the role of parents. All my 7 children attended the Boston Public Schools, which may seem inconsistent with the theme of this event. They did because I was the state official responsible for racial justice in the public education system, and didn't feel that I could keep my own children out of the schools that I was desegregating. But I've also served for many years now as vice president of OIDEL, which is a Geneva-based organization that promotes educational freedom around the world, and was also for many years on the board of the Council for American Private Education. So I'm strongly supportive of private and faith-based schools. And I'm also strongly supportive of homeschooling. I think all of these models are choices that parents should be able to make. I want to just make 2 comments because time is short. One is in response to Alexandre's earlier comment about education occurring only in the home, I would say every school provides instruction, usually deliberately, and education often unintentionally. That is, education in terms of the shaping of character and habits and loyalties. And it's precisely because education is inescapable in any setting in which children are being, are being taught together, that schools often educate against the values of parents. And that's the importance of what Sharon was telling us about. Many parents object to the sorts of education provided in schools, and that's often why they, in fact, choose to put their children in faith-based schools or to homeschool them. It seems to me it is completely right, as Alexandre and others have said, that it is the family that has the authority to determine the sort of education that children will receive, and that the state's role ought to be limited to ensuring that every child is instructed, that is, acquires the skills and knowledge necessary to participate in the society. And then on Terry's illuminating discussion just now, it seems to me this is a reminder that the present pandemic moment is an opportunity to fundamentally rethink the way in which we provide education and instruction, to rethink the role of parents. Many families, millions of families, are now taking on roles in relation to their children's instruction and education, which they never imagined being involved in. And I don't think that matters are simply going to return to the status quo ante. I think we will see new changes developing, and that it's a time to be inventive and imaginative and to think through what we really want to see accomplished and how families can be an essential part of accomplishing that, whether or not their children are attending institutional schools on a full or a part-time basis. It is a time to reinvent and rethink the role of the family, and Terry's comments were a useful way to begin to think about that role. And let me stop at that point because you want time for at least some questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Glenn, and everyone else. And we actually the attendees and everyone has done a good job to chat and to respond to some of the issues that have been raised. And thank you all for keeping the time. What we want is to encourage everyone that there is a very good research plenary session that is going on. A link has been provided by Trudy in the chat menu. You can look that up, and we'll be glad to see everyone joining on that. Otherwise, as we close our time together, I want to thank our speakers, all of you who have presented very well. Thank you very much for your thoughtful remarks. And I want to thank you for choosing to invest your time in this session. As a reminder, this session was recorded and will be available in the future. And if you want to learn more about GHEX and to support our mission, please visit www.ghex.world. Indeed, homeschooling is a global movement from what we've seen, and it's a global solution. So thank you for being part of today's session. The role of parents, you've all ably presented on this, and I think our parents have had a lot to learn from this, which now comes to the end. And I want to encourage you that please, you can join into the other sessions until when we can meet next time. Thank you very much. From me here, Godfrey Kyazze, and the GHEX board, thank you. God bless you all. We appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you to everybody.
Yep. Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.